What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, I have an absolutely insane game where Alireza Firouzja is forced to sacrifice a piece very early in the opening for 3 pawns just to hang on against Magnus Carlsen. Trust me, this game is wild. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus Alireza Firouzja from the 2024 Chessable Masters Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Magnus opens 1 g3, a very provocative move, intending bishop g2, but overall this move is very, very rare. Instead, e4, d4, c4, and knight of 3 are more common at the highest level. But Alireza, he is not phased. He just goes d5, expanding in the center, gaining control of the middle of the board, and threatening the move e5, getting those 2 beautiful pawns on d5 and e5. Magnus knows this. He goes knight f3, controlling e5 himself, stopping the e5 advance, and now Magnus is going for that famous king's Indian attack setup with bishop g2, short castles, and so on. And how will Alireza counter it? Well, here he does go g6, intending bishop g7, heading for sort of a symmetrical-ish variation of this opening. And the point being, after bishop g2, then bishop g7, here black is threatening e5 as that bishop does control that square. So black is once again threatening to gain control of the center. And this does force Magnus Carlsen's hand. Here he is forced to go d4, expanding in the center himself, and now after knight to f6, we have a very symmetrical looking position. All right, now Magnus, c4 is the move, gaining space on the queen side, and Alireza does go c6 himself, supporting d5 instead of taking on c4. Now here, both sides do castle, castles, and castles, and here is the first big branching point of this game. In this position, white has a million different options. Just to run through the gamut, Gukesh played rook to e1 in his world championship match against Ding Liren. That was a mostly new move. It's not exactly super strong, but it did catch Ding Liren off guard a little bit, as it's almost never been played at the high GM level. Beyond that, you can go, for example, queen c2, queen b3, queen a4, knight a3, knight c3, knight d2, c takes d5, knight e5, and so on. Almost everything here for white is playable, but in this game, Magnus goes for one of the most uncompromising moves in this position, that is knight to c3. What is the idea behind this move? Well, overall, c3 is a very good square for that knight. Of course, c6 is not available for black, therefore black cannot play the copycat variation here and go knight c6. However, the drawback of this move, if black just takes on c4, d takes c4, then he will be threatening to hang on to that extra pawn almost forever with the move b5 in the spirit of the semi-Slav opening. And that is exactly what happens here. Here, black takes on c4, d takes c4. That is by far the strongest move, again, in the spirit of the Slav or the semi-Slav opening. Now here Magnus shows his idea. He goes e4, seizing control of the center, and now Alireza b5 is the move, and black is officially up an entire pawn on the queen side, and white is going to be down a pawn in the middle game. Okay, what is the idea behind this opening from white's perspective? It's very simple. He gets those pawns in the center. Those pawns are very, very strong, and white may be threatening ideas like e5 or even d5, then e5, gaining control in the center and starting a kingside attack against the black king. Of course, before he does that, he will have to develop some of his pieces, and here Magnus shows exactly how to do that. He goes queen to e2. That is the best placement for the queen and the best move on the board. After this, he can go, say, rook e1 or rook d1 and continue developing. All right, Alireza, how does he want to play this? Well, there are a few different ideas here. For example, that pawn on d4 is a little bit vulnerable. Therefore, bishop g4 does come to mind, pinning that knight on f3 to the queen on e2 and threatening an idea like bishop takes and then queen takes d4. Instead, black also has ideas based on going either b4 or a5, gaining space on the queen side. In the game, a5 was played by Alireza. The point being, if white goes a4 at some point, then you can go b4, and those pawns on a5 and b4 would be very, very solid. Now here, Magnus, he ignores the queen side entirely, and he just sticks to his guns. He goes rook d1. That is the best placement for the rook, putting it opposing the black queen on d8, and the queen doesn't necessarily want to move yet. Therefore, this will be some very uncomfortable pressure on the d file on the black queen by the white rook. All right, now Alireza Alireza, he continues, knight bd7. That is the best placement for the knight and the best move on the board. Now here, Magnus has once again a very big decision to make. The first big decision was knight to c3. Playing that move, he gave up that pawn on c4. After that, he went queen e2 and rook d1. Those are the best placements for those two pieces, and now he has to make a decision. Do you want to strike in the center immediately, or do you want to continue developing? If you want to continue developing, there are plenty of moves. For example, b3 is a very interesting way to try and open up lines on the queen side. That would really make it a permanent pawn sacrifice. And beyond that, you can go, say, bishop b3, bishop f4, and so on, developing yet another piece. But instead of that, right here, Magnus, he makes a very thematic pawn sacrifice. It's very typical for these semi-Slav positions when black takes on c4. He plays the move d5. Now, this move is connected with an idea. If black takes on d5, white is not going to take back with the knight or the pawn. Instead, what he's going to do is going to go e5, driving back that knight. And the reason you don't want to go e5 right away is if you go e5 right here, then the knight jumps into the d5 square. So the point of d5 is that black takes, then you go e5. d5 is occupied by the black pawn, and therefore knight d5 is not possible. And that is what happens here. So black takes on d5, c takes d5, and now here, this is where the complications begin. Magnus makes the move e5. The point being, again, that square d5 is occupied by the pawn. Two pieces in chess cannot occupy the same square. Therefore, knight d5 is not a legal move. It is not a possibility. Now here, if you just move the knight, let's say you go knight to e8 or knight g4, both of those moves would be very dubious. For example, knight g4 is the lesser of the two evils, but then white just goes knight takes d5, winning that pawn on d5. The knight's very active. The knight on g4 is very, very awkwardly placed, and white would have a massive initiative for that sacrifice pawn, not to mention this diagonal opening up for the Carlen-style bishop on g2. Therefore here, Alireza, he has to find the right response. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now. Try to find the key response for Alireza Firouzja right here in this position. All right, hope you found it. The key idea for black, of course, you don't move the knight. You counterattack on the queen side with the move b4. Very typical in these semi-Slav style positions. What is the point? If white takes on f6, then you take back. So here, white does take, and here, very importantly, do you take on c3 with the pawn, or do you take perhaps with the knight on f6? Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to solve this one right here. Now, very importantly, if you take on c3, that is a losing move. I do want to show this. If you take on c3, white takes on g7, threatening the rook on f8. That tempo is so important. If black takes the pawn, white takes on d5 with the rook, and if black ever takes on b2, bishop takes b2, hits the king, the bishop is too active, and overall, white would have a dominant position, as you can see by the eval bar on the left skyrocketing. Therefore, instead of b takes c3, knight takes f6 was played by Alireza, a very good move. Now here, that knight on c3 is still under attack. It has to move, knight b5, played in the game, and finally, we are in a position where we can slow down and do inventory. What the heck has happened here? All right, in this position, Magnus Carlsen has 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces versus the 1, 2, 3 of Alireza. That means white is up a piece, but in return for that sacrifice piece, Alireza has 1, 2, 3 extra pawns in the middle of the board. This is about as imbalanced a position as you can get in the middle game. This is going to be an all-out slugfest from here. And sure enough, the computer says it's virtually dead even in this position. How about that? All right, Alireza, how does he want to continue? Well, you do want to do something about stabilizing your center or driving out that knight on b5. Therefore, the best moves include e6, for example, and maybe bishop a6 or bishop g4, trying to put some pressure on the white position. However, in the game, Alireza makes a little bit of an inaccuracy. He goes bishop d7, and this move, while it does put pressure on that knight, it is a little bit weaker than the other way to do that, that being bishop a4 as on, a6, as on a6, that bishop would be opposing both the knight and the queen via the x-ray attack. So overall, that would be a little bit better for black. Instead, bishop d7 played in the game. Now we have a4, defending that knight with the pawn. The point being, if black takes en passant, then you you can just take back with the knight. Knight takes a3, and you are doing just fine. So for now, that pawn will be defending that knight. Now, Alireza, he has the option, of course, of just taking on b5, but will he go for that in the game? Well, in the game, he actually does. Bishop takes b5 is the move. Of course, it wasn't forced. He could just go e6, bolstering d5, but instead, bishop takes b5 played in the game. Now we have a takes b5, e6, Alireza getting the incredible pawn chain on the light squares here. You don't see 4 in a row like that very often with the pawns. Now we have knight d4, the knight jumping in, and very importantly, threatening that c6 square, which would be supported by the, what do you call this? What do you call it when you have a pawn that is literally in front of all of the other enemy pawns? There has to be a name for that. You know what? Like, drop a comment down below. I'm breaking the commentary here. Drop a comment down below. What is this pawn called? I don't know. But anyway, the knight being supported by the mystery pawn on b5. All right, now here, Alireza a4, gaining space on the queen side. Then we have knight to c6. Sure enough, the knight jumping in, being supported by that mystery pawn. Now here, queen to b6. The queen gets out of the attack, pressuring the mystery pawn. And now what is white going to do about it? Well, he gives up that pawn. He goes knight takes b4, winning the b4 one, and black takes on b5. Queen takes b5. Now here again, white still has the extra piece, that being the light squared bishop against those 3 extra pawns of Alireza. And again, the game is relatively equal so far. All right, we got bishop d2, defending that knight on b4. Of course, it was being attacked. Now knight d7. Alireza playing a very important move, a very important idea. Retreating his knight to d7, perhaps wanting to go to c5, and on c5, that knight would be very, very active on the d3 and e4 squares and b3, and also, just as importantly, opening up this diagonal for the dark squared bishop. That dragon Sicilian-style bishop is now entering the game. All right, now, bishop c3 is the move for Magnus, opposing that black bishop on g7. Then we have knight to c5, as promised, and now here, Magnus, he turns up the heat with the move h4, the alpha 0 advance. The point being he's threatening h5, and then either h takes g6 or even h6 in the spear of alpha 0. The point being that pawn could be an absolute menace later in this game. All right, here, Alireza, knight to b3 is the move. Hits that rook on a1. Where is the rook going to go? It's not going anywhere just yet. First of all, bishop takes g7, ignoring the attack on the rook. The point being, the bishop also pressures f8. Therefore, black is forced to play king takes g7. And again, before defending the rook, here Magnus goes queen to e5, hitting the king on g7. This is very committal, because if black goes, say, I don't know, f6, trying to drive back that queen, if white doesn't deliver yet another check, then that knight on a3 will be hanging. And here, sure enough, black does go for it. He goes for the bend, find, go counterattack with the move f6. Very, very strong. And very importantly, if you don't play that, let's say you go king to g8, then the move h5, threatening h6 and queen g7 checkmate, would be very, very dangerous. You just can't allow that. So, the good old-fashioned bend, find, go counterattack played in the game, f6, one of the strongest moves on the chessboard in any position. Now, queen takes e6, gobbles at that pawn, and now, very importantly, both the knight and the rook on a1 are hanging. Which one does Alireza want? He wants that knight, first of all. Queen takes b4 played in the game. The point being, if you take the rook, then you could move the knight, and overall, white would be doing okay. Instead, queen takes b4 played in the game. Then we have rook takes d5, white ignoring the attack on the rook to win yet another pawn. The point being, rook d7 is a very dangerous threat. Now here, black, he's got to defend. There is no time for knight takes a1. Again, if you do that, then rook to d7 would be deadly. Now here, how should black defend? Well, the strongest move is just rook a to e8, hitting the queen on e6 with a gain of tempo. That would be the way forward. Instead, rook to a7 played in the game, the rook lift on the 7th rank, but this turns out to be quite a bit weaker, and it gives the goat just enough time to go rook a d1, doubling up those rooks on the d file, and again threatening rook d7. Now we have rook to e7, pressuring the queen, but here Magnus, he is not slowing down. He plays the move rook to d7. The rook is now pinned to the king. Therefore, rook takes e6 is not a legal move. All right, Alireza, rook f to f7, he defends, but here Magnus, rook takes, and then again, rook to d7, the second time we've seen that move, and again, the rook is pinned to the king, therefore rook takes e6 is not possible. All right, rook takes d7 played in the game, then queen takes d7, king to h6, bishop d5, the queen and bishop are coordinating very, very well, the threat being perhaps bishop g8, queen takes h7, and so on. Now queen to e1 hits the king, king g2, knight d2, threatening ideas like queen to f1 check, both sides going all out for the attack. Now queen to a7, defending that f2 pawn, that could be very important later in the game. Then we have queen to e5, centralizing the queen and pressuring the bishop. Queen to c5 defends the bishop, and king g7 gets the king to safety. All right, now queen to a5, sliding over with the queen, a3 marches that pawn down the board, then b takes a3, and then c3. The point being now black has a very strong pass pawn on c3. That was the idea of this pawn sacrifice, a3, trying to deflect the pawn on b2 away from the defense of this pawn going to c3. And very importantly, if you go queen takes a3 here, then you lose the bishop on d5. So white being overloaded a little bit. So b takes a3, the born again alpha 0 a pawn, but it gives way to the pawn going to c3, and this pawn is much more dangerous than that born again alpha 0 pawn on the a3 square. Now, queen to a7 hits the king, king to h6, queen to c5, white trying to defend, but Alireza c2, threatening to promote on the next move. And again, if you take that pawn, you lose the game as you lose that bishop on d5, and the knight on d2 would actually be defended. So you can't do that. Instead, queen to f8 hits the king, king to h5, and here white has to find a very precise move to keep the game alive. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the very precise move Magnus Carlsen must find right here. Well, the key move is g4. The point being, whether the king takes on g4 or h4, one of those moves is forced as h6 is covered by the queen. After g4, let's say you take on g4, then queen b4 would keep the game alive. And instead, if you take on h4, g4, king takes h4, then queen to h6 again also keeps that game alive. Instead, in the game, Magnus Carlsen, he plays the move queen to f7. Now, this move defends the bishop, but as you can see by the eval bar on the left side of your screen collapsing, this move is no good. And here, Alireza, he plays one of the final moves of this game. He just goes h6, guarding the king. The pawns are coming to the defense of the king. And here, white is just basically screwed at this point. There's nothing he can do to defend both the bishop and the ongoing attacks against the white king. And here, white goes queen d7, one last move. But in this position, Magnus Carlsen simply resigns on the spot to Alireza Firouzja, and here is why. In this position, black can simply go c1, promoting to a queen, and it'll be 2-on-1 with the queens, and there's nothing white can do to hang on. So for that reason, right here in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigned on the spot to Alireza Firouzja before he could play the sweet move c1, promoting to a queen. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja in the 2024, what was it called? It was the Chessable Masters Tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button. And if you want to see more games where Alireza Firouzja sacrifices a piece out of the opening, check out this video right here, where Alireza Firouzja plays a well-known knight sacrifice in the Italian opening. Knight takes f7 was played early in the game in a well-known position. That game took place in the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. If you want to see a wild game, check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.